Welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Hester, and I am the Associate Director of Citrus at UC Merced, and I am an Associate Professor in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at UC Merced as well. I would like to welcome all of you to the 14th year of the Citrus Research Exchange Seminar Series. We have hosted a remarkable lineup of technology innovators in person at Sitarjadai Hall, and we're glad to see all of you are able to join us virtually today for our Spring 2022 series. Today, we are joined by Dr. Crystal Kolden. Crystal is a professor in the Management of Complex Systems Department at UC Merced, and Crystal is a pyrogeographer. She conducts research on fire science, wildfire disaster mitigation, and works with communities and agencies globally to develop and implement adaptation strategies. She began her career as a wildland firefighter for the U.S. Forest Service, and then obtained her Ph.D. in geography from Clark University. She has spent the last 2 decades seeking to understand how wildfires become disasters and how we can live with wildfire but prevent disasters in an increasingly complex socio-environmental landscape under climate change. It is my great honor to welcome Crystal Kolden.
Thank you so much for having me today on the Citrus Research Exchange. I'm thrilled to be here and be talking about a topic that's obviously near and dear to my heart, but is very pertinent for all of us as we in most years, I think we would be normally heading into fire season, but as we have seen in the last month or so here in California, fire season has become and continues to be year-round, and we are facing a very different world than we did historically. So I want to talk today about how we can begin to mitigate wildfire disasters, which we've seen with increasing frequency in recent years, and really coming at this from a complex systems perspective. So overview of my talk, one of the things that people ask is, why haven't we solved this wildfire problem? This is it seems like something we should have solved, right? We've been working on this a while now. And to do that, I will ask, what are some of the common misconceptions about potential solutions that have been proposed? And what are some of the known solutions that we can amplify and enhance across the socio-ecological spectrum? So why do we have a problem in the first place? Well, fire is really this natural process across California and most of the US, right? And prior to European colonization, we had a substantial amount of fire in the state. Obviously not records necessarily during that time, but estimates from reconstructions from tree rings and from stories of indigenous fire use and early settler records indicate that we're talking about millions of acres a year in California alone, burning, and through both lightning ignitions in the mountains, and then also substantial amounts of indigenous burning, particularly at lower elevations and in the foothills. And during that period, we didn't have wildfire disasters, right? Fire was a natural part of this landscape. It was widely utilized by the humans that were on this landscape at this time. And the disaster is this much more contemporary human construct. We have created a scenario that has resulted in substantial numbers of disasters in recent years. And it is really that departure from the earlier conditions that has provided that construct. Oops. Yeah, I'll put forward slides this way. Okay. So when we think about the evolution of wildfire disasters, they've looked really different over time. And when we look at 150 years ago in the upper Midwest, it's often forgotten that there was a whole series of wildfire disasters in the upper Midwest in the late 19th and early 20th century. where wildfires burned in relatively remote areas. And these were often associated with the logging enterprise that was occurring across the upper Midwest at this time, leaving behind substantial amounts of slash, bringing in railroads that threw sparks everywhere. And one of the most famous fires is the 1871 Peshtigo fire, which you've probably never heard of because it was completely overshadowed by the 1871 Chicago fire, which happened on the exact same day, driven by dry, hot winds across the entire upper Midwest on this day. But in the Peshtigo fire, the estimate is that at least 1,500 people died in this massive wildfire, potentially upwards of 2,000, many bodies never found along the area on the north side of Green Bay across the Wisconsin-Michigan line. That type of event and the multiple events that had hundreds to thousands of fatalities, it didn't really change US policy on wildfires. What did change it was in the early 1900s, there were a series of wildfires, and sort of the primary incident which fundamentally changed how the US approaches wildfire was the Great Fires of 1910 across northern Idaho and western Montana. And these fires burned about 3 million acres of predominantly virgin timber. And that timber was worth a lot of money to the timber barons who had had every intention of cutting it down and bringing it to market. And so the people with the deep pockets were able to pressure Congress into funding the US Forest Service to essentially extinguish all new wildfires so that we didn't have any continued loss of this highly valuable timber in these huge wildfires. That suppression activity and the 1911 Weeks Act that funded the Forest Service to essentially become the suppression agency in the US, well, it worked. We got really good at fire suppression. And what we have worked out in the last couple of decades is that that was actually not a good thing, because in a Western US and other parts of the US as well, where fire was prevalent and frequent prior to European settlement, having suppression of all that fire really produced this massive accumulation of dead fuel and has produced enormously dense and what we often call overstocked forests. At the same time, human-caused climate change has fundamentally changed the conditions that these forests are growing in, and it has really increased the aridity across the Western US. And so that increased aridity, it dries the fuel out, it dries the soils out, it makes everything that much more flammable and available to burn. And it really has provided more opportunities, more days of the year when fires can grow excessively rapidly and have really high energy release during combustion. At the same time, we humans, of course, and particularly I speak as myself as a European colonizer, descendant of a European colonizer, we have expanded across this landscape. And so in California, this is particularly evident where we have actually expanded our settlements across the state and increasingly into rural areas. And this brings two challenges. One is that humans are now setting a lot of these fires accidentally or intentionally, and two, that our settlements and our built infrastructure is highly susceptible to burning and actually adds to the fuel on this landscape, right? So what this has resulted in is what we've seen in the last few years, this huge increase in area burned across the Western US, particularly relative to sort of the middle part of the 20th century. And so in the last couple of years, and this does not include the last couple of years, but we continue to see sort of these record years in terms of the largest fire in the Western US and the contiguous US burned in 2020 in Northern California. The August complex was over 1 million acres. We see the largest years on record, and we see individual states continuing to set records for large fires and cumulative area burned over the last few years. And a part of what I ask in my research is size really a good indicator for us? We have this obsession with fire size, and we see this all the time in headlines. Oh, this was the largest fire ever. I just listed off all these records. But part of what fire ecology research has demonstrated continually is that size is not really a very good indicator of fire disasters, because so much of the terrestrial land surface is considered a fire evolved biome. Right, these are ecological systems that evolved with fire. Many of them actually need fire. It's a requisite for reproduction in many cases, and for maintaining healthy ecological process. And so when we look at North America and across the Western US, we see that basically all of our biomes in the Western US, and certainly California, had evolved with fire at different frequencies, at different severities. And so that's our first indicator that size is really not a very good metric for disasters. Our second indicator that it's not a very good size is that in California history, some of our smallest fires have actually been some of our most disastrous. In 1933, the Griffith Park fire burned just outside of Los Angeles. It was only 47 acres, but it killed 29 people. A few years ago, that would have been one of the highest totals in US history. Now that is sort of fallen down the list because of the recent disasters that we've had in the last 5 years. Similarly, in 1991, the Bay Area saw a massive wildfire disaster in the Tunnel Oakland Hills fire. Again, this was a relatively small fire. It only ended up being about 1,500 acres, but 25 people were killed and nearly 3,000 homes were consumed. So this is another indicator that size is not a very good metric for what actually constitutes a wildfire disaster. So instead, we start to say, all right, where are the actual disastrous impacts? And what are the things that we can measure to have a better understanding and a better way of characterizing wildfire disasters? So we look at things like homes that are burned. These are primary wildfire impacts. It's a direct loss as a result of that wildfire burning. And we have seen in recent years these horrifying pictures coming out of fires, particularly in California, but across the Western US, of entire neighborhoods and communities burning. We have also, of course, had an increase in fatalities. In the 2018 Camp Fire had 85 fatalities associated with that directly during the burning period. And of course, these are clear indicators that these are disastrous wildfire outcomes because of these incredibly undesirable impacts. But there's also secondary wildfire impacts that we need to consider. And so one of the things that we've seen in recent years is that we are getting increasing numbers of secondary wildfire hazards, such as the mudslides that happened after the 2017 Thomas fire in Santa Barbara County. And the fire itself was disastrous for many people in the Thomas fire area in Santa Barbara, Ventura counties, but about 2 weeks after the fire ended, there was a massive rain event in the town of Montecito, and that event killed 23 people from boulders and mud rolling down these streams and taking out houses in the floodplain. So that's a secondary impact. Other types of secondary impacts, massive floods from the resulting change in runoff in burn areas. This is from Idaho after a 2013 fire event. Additional types of secondary impacts are ones that people often don't think about, but as we see an increase in the built infrastructure burning during wildfires, we are starting to see issues with toxins infiltrating municipal water supplies. When you get PVC pipes and other infrastructure burning, it actually leaches toxins into the water supply system, and we end up having boil water orders put in place for days or even weeks and months on end, and the water is not drinkable. We don't have safe water supplies. Additionally, we see interruptions to some of our other components of built infrastructure from things like earth movement. This photograph is from an area in southern Idaho after a pair of 2013 wildfires, where there was substantial levels of earth movement in post-fire runoff. And just upstream of where this picture is taken, not only did this slide cut off this highway, but just upstream of here, there is a dam that holds back a reservoir that has about 30% of the water supply for the city of Boise, Idaho, the capital. And that dam, there was actually damage to this earthen dam from post-fire erosion and runoff. And there were real concerns that they might lose the dam because of this post-fire runoff and having all of this massive amounts of sediment washing down into the reservoir. So these are all these sort of secondary impacts that are directly resulting from wildfire and being compounded by other factors. We have ancillary wildfire impacts that aren't necessary sort of direct outcomes of the wildfire itself, but are sort of impacts to broader communities. And so we have substantial changes in certain communities associated with wildfire. So the fire suppression obsession that overtook the US and other European colonized countries at the end of the 19th and early 20th century fundamentally impacted certain indigenous communities, which for many indigenous communities, and this is a picture from Australia, Aboriginal fire, but this is absolutely true across California. We have communities that fire is a key component of their core culture. And so removing fire, it's not talked about as much, but in many communities, in many indigenous communities, it had much the same effect as the residential schools at essentially stamping out core cultural facets of those communities. Other types of ancillary impacts, we see major impacts to fisheries post-wildfire, and it occurs from both the runoff into fisheries, changes in the water temperature from changes in forest cover. And again, this impacts both indigenous communities that have cultural relationships to fish like salmon. It also impacts rural communities that have a high reliance on that natural resource. Similarly, we have ancillary impacts where certain cultural icons are impacted. This is a picture of a rather fascinating little plant in Tasmania, Australia, that is what we call a paleo-endemic. It's left over from when Australia broke off as part of the Gondwanan supercontinent about 100 million years ago. It was still hanging out. And this is one of these leftover plants from that period in time that still exists in Tasmania. It is not adapted to fire at all, and increasing levels of wildfire in Tasmania are actually threatening this plant. And it's a core part of Tasmanian cultural heritage. We have something like this in California. It's called a giant sequoia. And giant sequoias are really this key cultural icon in California. It's our charismatic megaflora. And giant sequoia are very much threatened by increasing wildfire, because while they are adapted to high frequency and low severity fire, which has relatively low heat output and has relatively low flame lengths, what is happening in the Sierra right now is that incredibly high severity wildfires are killing giant sequoia. And because these trees are thousands of years old, they're not going to be able to regenerate anytime soon, and may not ever, based on climate change. So we're losing some of these key cultural components as part of these wildfire impacts. For anyone that lives in an area that is affected by PSPS, public safety power shutoffs, you are well familiar with another ancillary wildfire impact, which is that PG&E and other utilities are now literally shutting down the power when there are hot, dry wind events for fear of igniting a wildfire. And so you can literally lose power at any point in time purely because of the fear of wildfire ignition, because PG&E particularly has been a culprit in many of our recent major wildfire disasters when their lines ignite. So this is an ancillary impact of our current wildfire situation, right? And that's just a smattering of metrics, but it really brings us back to this question of, all right, so Crystal, what you're telling me is that I should stop paying attention to fire size. Yes, that is absolutely what I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is that if we are going to be able to mitigate wildfire disasters, we have to find other metrics and try to mitigate those specific disaster outcomes and impacts, right? Whether it's smoke, whether it's some of the impacts that I talked about to the water supply and ecological services, or making sure that we are mitigating structure loss and fatalities. So one of the questions that people then often ask me is, all right, so we're going to try and mitigate these wildfire disaster impacts. How do we do this? Can we use technology to do this? I mean, we're a pretty advanced society. And the fascinating thing about fire is that it's actually a pretty simple thing from a physics and chemistry perspective, right? There's a thing called a fire triangle. Here's the only three things you need to make fire: oxygen, heat or an ignition source, and fuel. And if you have those three things in the right balance, you will have combustion. And so the basic premise of fire extinction for several centuries has been to put the wet stuff on the hot stuff, right? And we apply water to fire specifically because it lowers the heat content and reduces the availability of fuel to burn. So that's been the basic premise for a long time. That hasn't changed. And what we often think about is, all right, well, what are the things that we think that we can do to prevent wildfire disasters? The most common misconception about preventing wildfire disasters is that we can prevent fire. So this is the most common misconception. People ask me all the time, how do we stop ignitions? We can't. It's that simple. And why can't we? Why doesn't this work? Well, first of all, we can't stop any natural disaster, right? And wildfires are a natural process. As I mentioned, there's a fair portion of fires, most fires in the United States actually are caused by lightning. That's not true in California, but across other parts of the US it is. So we have always had disasters because we've always had these natural processes that we cannot prevent. We would never deign to say that we would stop earthquakes, right? One of our largest disasters in the state of California, of course, was 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And nobody said, oh, well, let's see if we can stop earthquakes, right? No, that would be silly. And yet we've tried to do that with fire and say, oh, well, we can stop fire from happening. We can't. We have too many ignitions that are started by lightning, which of course we have no control over. And then we have the human component, right? And so when we look at what this distribution of human fire ignitions looks like, California has a real dichotomy in ignitions, where in our mountainous regions, most wildfire ignitions are from lightning, and in our more urban and semi-urban areas and in the Central Valley, most of our ignitions are from humans. And what we see is that we really have sort of a balance of these two very different types of ignitions that changes over the course of the year. And in California, I've highlighted here that California is really Mediterranean California, and then what we call the northwestern forested mountains, which includes the Sierra Nevada and the northwestern part of the state. And what you'll see in both of these is that over the course of the year, there are different types of ignitions that dominate, but that we really do get both types of ignitions year round. And, you know, some of those ignitions are predictable. So this giant spike nationally is in the middle of the summer. That's a human ignition. And although it's not clear because of where the x-axis is here, this spike is July 4th. That is us setting off fireworks like crazy and igniting wildfires all over the landscape, right? And we see that spike in California, despite the bans on fireworks across the vast majority of the state. So that is the type of thing that's really predictable that we could potentially do something about and have tried to do through those sorts of bans. Other types of human ignitions are less predictable. And when people ask sort of, okay, well, what are the ones that we can do something about? What are the ones that we can't? Well, lightning, believe it or not, we're actually pretty good at predicting lightning. There's this perception that, well, if we could only just improve it, we could figure out where we could stop lightning fires immediately. We're actually very good at predicting where lightning is likely to ignite fires. Certain human ignitions we're very good at predicting, right? Along roads, that is where the vast majority of our human ignitions occur. And we're very good at predicting that. We're also very good at putting those out right away because we know that they're going to occur there, and it's easy for fire suppression resources to access those quickly and put those fires out, right? Other types of human ignitions, arsons, those are chaotic. We can't predict them very well. We're also very good at detecting fires, right? Particularly in the wildland urban interface. This is another common misconception, is that we are not very good at detecting. No, we actually are. The problem is that our response time often exceeds what we call the critical growth window, right? So when we have an ignition, we have sort of a short period of time where that fire is still relatively small before it gets really big and much more difficult to suppress. And in California, depending on the time of year, depending on what fuel you're in, that can be a pretty short ignition window or a little bit longer ignition window. And that response time is the critical part. And you can imagine on a lot of our freeway clogged or traffic clogged freeways in California, it can be difficult for fire suppression to get there quickly. It takes time to launch airplanes. And, you know, in a lot of places, we have back roads that are very windy and slow driving. Despite this, we actually still quickly suppress 99% of new ignitions, right? So 99% of our ignitions, we're really good at putting them out quickly. It's that other 1% that gets us. And you know, that quick ignition response is partially thanks to increases in our detection ability with technology. One of the things that we see is that things like the amount of air traffic in places around California and the fact that everybody now has cell phones, we basically have very, very fast reporting of new fires. But in a lot of our rural areas, it can take a long time for fire suppression to actually get someplace. And as an example, I often give, this is where I live up in Tuolumne County. I live just outside the town of Tuolumne. And from my house over to Groveland, which is the small town that you pass through on Highway 120 on your way to Yosemite from the Bay Area, from my house to Groveland is about 10 miles as the crow flies. 10 miles, that's it. But what you see on this terrain enhanced map is that you have to cross over the Stanislaus River Canyon to get there. So for me to drive the whopping 10 miles as the crow flies from my house to Groveland takes anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour and a half, because the roads are tiny, they're winding, there's only one bridge across the Stanislaus River. upstream of this reservoir, and it's a one-lane bridge that's highly questionable under certain conditions. So this is the type of terrain and the back roads and the slow response time that fire suppression agencies are dealing with in the backcountry. And so it really is not a question of predicting or detecting ignitions, but getting to those ignitions during that critical growth window. Solution number two, the other thing that people talk about in predicting and detecting ignitions is, well, okay, you're telling me that we can't detect these across the whole landscape, or that we're actually doing a good job detecting across the whole landscape, but we can't really get there quickly. So what can we do, right? What is the thing that we can do that actually matters for ignition detection? And the place where it matters the most is actually on structures. So one of the things that wildfire structure science has figured out pretty quickly is that when structures ignite, it is not quickly. Oftentimes you have a whole bunch of embers that land in sort of this firebrand shower on roofs, in gutters, in the vegetation that people often plant around their houses, and hedgerows and shrubs under windows, things like that. And that those little embers will sit there and burn for minutes to hours and finally light a house on fire. But that there is often a period when those embers could be extinguished quickly, but of course nobody's home because they've been evacuated, right? So one of the things that we can do is actually work on responding to ignitions in a highly localized way on structures, right? So things like exterior sprinklers have been suggested as a potential solution. That's a great solution where you have a lot of water and good high water pressure, but imagine an entire suburb that has sprinklers on their roofs, all coming on at the exact same time when a wildfire is burning. You're going to lose water pressure pretty quickly. So there's some cool stuff that's happening on the science front. There's I think, I don't remember if he's a high school kid or he's now a college kid. A young man in the Bay Area came up with this cool little invention of putting fire extinguish remote ignited triggered, fire extinguishing canisters on fences and houses that could actually put out some of these embers once they sense them. That's a potential solution that might actually work, right? If it's really localized rather than landscape scale. And really that's where we see the greatest need to try and mitigate structural losses, is that point ignition, right? So that could be a solution that might work, as opposed to trying to predict and to detect and suppress ignitions across entire landscapes. Another place that people think, oh, well, if we address this, then it'll all work out, is in the prediction of risk, right? And so one of the proposed solutions is, well, if we can just identify where the highest wildfire risk is, people will move, right? And they won't want to live in those high fire risk areas. They will move away because it's so high risk. And this is often proposed as a solution in the media. Oh, we just need to stop letting people live in these fire prone places, then we won't have disasters anymore. We don't do that for any other natural hazard. Most of our largest cities in the Western US are built exactly on top of earthquake faults. So we obviously are not doing this for other hazards. And for wildfire, it's particularly challenging because wildfire is something that can burn wherever there is vegetation under the right conditions, right? So we really have this high hazard potential across huge swaths of the Western US. And to suggest that people should just move out of those places, I don't really know where they're going to go. And I'm one of these people. I just showed you, I lived in Tuolumne County. I'm in the bright red part of this map, right? I live in a very high fire hazard zone, and I moved here intentionally, right? And people will continue to move to high fire hazard areas, whether it's because it's very desirable, like the entire area of Malibu, which is some of the most expensive real estate in California. No one's going to leave there despite it being very high fire hazard. Or they will move to these places because they simply can't afford to live anywhere else, right? And that's a social challenge, is that some of our highest fire hazard areas are the places people move to because they can't afford to live anywhere else. And affordable housing is absolutely a problem we have in the state of California. All right. So there's some of the things that we make assumptions about that aren't actual solutions, right? But what are the things that we have demonstrated, and I say we in the most liberal way, which is basically fire science, right? What are some of the actual solutions that fire science has honed in on as this works, right? As I mentioned before, one of the things we can do is to stop specific types of human ignitions, right? And so one of the things that's being talked a lot in California right now is power line ignitions, particularly under high winds, right? And we have these public safety power shutoffs that have been proposed and implemented a few times now to try and minimize the number of power line ignitions. PG&E recently announced last year that they're going to bury something like 10,000 miles of power lines to try and modify this. Is that really the only solution, right? Or are there other types of solutions, things like microgrids, things like increasing solar, that could actually also mitigate some of these power line ignition types? This is an area where we can actually do really important ignition suppression, and it will really matter a lot because the conditions under which power lines ignite wildfires are the exact same conditions when those fires then grow and become catastrophic, right? The power line ignites in the middle of winter in 5 feet of snow, and it lights a single tree on fire, that's not going anywhere. But when a lot of these fires ignite with power lines is under hot, dry conditions that produce outcomes like the 2018 Camp Fire. Another thing that we can do in terms of stopping specific human ignitions is addressing our transportation and equipment ignitions, right? And so one of the things that we see is, I mentioned a lot of fires ignite along roadways. And one of the things is that contributes to that is that we have vehicle fires. And so people are driving up a steep mountain road, particularly trucks or older vehicles, and their engine overheats and they actually get a vehicle fire where the car ignites. Obviously, if your car ignites while you're driving it, you're going to panic. You move over to the side of the road, you drive straight into the vegetation, and now we have a wildfire. Right. And so actual technological improvements to equipment have already reduced this. They can continue to reduce this. We can minimize the number of sparks that come off of trains. We can minimize sparks coming off of chains dragging off of vehicles. These are technological solutions that can actually minimize these type of ignitions. One of the things that we have seen recently is lawsuits around tool use, power tool use. For example, the 2009 Jesucita fire in Santa Barbara County was ignited when a commercial grade trimmer or weed whacker, depending on what you call it, was working in an area, actually ironically trying to reduce fire danger by reducing the amount of vegetation. The power tool the blade struck a rock, threw a spark, and we got the Jesucita fire, which burned down a couple hundred houses, right? So we've had some improvements in technology, things like spark arresters, which have been around for a long time now. Those substantially reduce the number of sparks thrown, and some of the equipment improvements are continuing to improve our human ignition rates. We can also mitigate structural ignitions. This is one of the areas that we've made huge strides in reducing structural losses to wildfire, because we have a much better understanding of how structures ignite now, and what materials can be utilized to minimize that. So what we see a lot of is that older structures are particularly prone to burning in wildfires. I think there's about a 104-year-old house that burned in the Thomas Fire. It was really a homestead. Older homes, older materials, they are not fire resistant, right? And some of the things that we are prone to put on our houses for visual purposes or architectural designs, right, are also prone to burning. So this is another house from the Thomas Fire where a trellis system, right? This wood feature that's added on to an otherwise stucco house that burned because an ember landed on it. The house itself, thankfully, did not burn because stucco is less flammable, right? So these are the types of things that, as we begin to realize what actually mitigates fire, we can institute changes in policy about how structures are built that reduce that wildfire risk. And of course, in California, since 2007, the Section 7A policies around home construction have introduced wildland urban interface requirements for construction. Those are still limited only to the wildland urban interface. And one of the discussion topics in fire science is expanding those well beyond the wildland urban interface. We also have a challenge in California of our structures having to be also earthquake resistant, right? So this cement dome in Washington, which resisted a fire quite well, might not be legal in California because of our earthquake restrictions. So we've got sort of this dueling natural disaster challenge in a place like California. And we know what works though. That's the thing. It's a function of implementing it, making it affordable, and thinking about how all these little details work together, because it's the structure, it's the stuff around the structure, and it's the stuff across the landscape that all work together, and what humans actually do. Do they maintain their landscaping? Do they remember to close their windows when they're evacuating from a fire? All of those sorts of things are what determine whether or not a structure is going to burn. And so we see a lot of information around this now about creating defensible space. There are very few municipalities where this is required and actually enforced. So one of the things that is constantly under discussion for policy is science says this works. How do we actually continue to implement this from a policy perspective? And there's ongoing research from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety and other groups that are continuing to understand how not just the materials, but also the way that homes are constructed and their configuration facilitate greater or less ember congregation to burn homes down. And of course, if you've lived in California any amount of time and you're interested in fire, then you've seen a lot of discussion about actually thinning forests and using more prescribed fire so that we have lower tree densities and that fires will burn with less severity. Boats are pretty commonplace now across California for reducing fuel loads, right? These are all solutions that are about controlling that landscape scale, fuel matrix, and density, right? And of course, prescribed fire application has been in the news quite a bit. We had 2 bills in the state passed last year that are meant to try and improve our ability to use prescribed fire and really scale it up across the landscape. So that's an actual solution. And then, really, what all these things oftentimes forget is that we have to integrate these human factors, because one of the things that often gets left out is how humans play into this whole thing, right? We're the ones that are affected by disasters, and it's why we have a disaster in the first place. And we often don't talk about these things enough. So one of the reasons I say that wildfire is a social justice issue is that some people are more sensitive to fire than others. Some have very low adaptive capacity. There's great variance spatially across the landscape for who is the most sensitive and potential has the greatest potential for fire disasters, and that variability is part of what determines where the best types of mitigation strategies should be in place. And so there's been a lot of new research. This is actually relatively recent, looking at these human factors, right? And asking, okay, how do we quantify different types of social vulnerability to wildfire? And how does that inform what we do to mitigate wildfire disasters? And a great example of this that I looked at a few years ago was in the town of Montecito in the 2017 Thomas fire. And this was a fire that burned incredibly intensely when it hit Montecito under 60, 70 mile an hour downslope winds. And what we saw was that if we just looked at it at the surface in this particular fire, one of the things we saw was that as this fire hit the town of Montecito, they actually did a really great job of stopping it at the edge of town. So it didn't burn into town and create this massive disaster that burned down hundreds of homes. And one of the reasons was that when we looked at it, we found that the community, in partnership with Montecito Fire District, had basically created this really nice set of fire breaks, what I call the green necklace, across the top part of the community where it hit the wildlands, right? And as this fire, burning under extreme conditions, moved downhill into the community, even under high winds, the work that the community had done on their homes, on their landscapes, allowed firefighters to come in and safely stop the fire's forward movement in this place. And when we looked at this in a framework way, what we saw was the heart of this whole thing. It wasn't even necessarily the actual work that was done, it was the partnership that was created. So there's that human factor. They identified what needed to be done where and who needed help doing it. And they implemented these set of activities around this community partnership. So that pointed to human factors being really important, right? And this again is really variable across the state because we have really different types of communities that have different levels of human vulnerability. And, we have tourism towns, we have suburbs that are very well planned and lots of cul-de-sacs. And then we have rural housing, and all these different types of communities and their layouts really speak to needing different mitigation strategies. And so these really different mitigation strategies, when we put them all together, people ask, what does a fire resilient future community look like, right? And what I say is, it's not a community, it's a whole landscape. And it's understanding how different strategies work across different parts of that landscape to protect all the communities embedded within it, right? And protect them not just from those primary impacts of fire, but the secondary impacts and the smoke, and a lot of those ancillary impacts that are often forgotten, but have potentially much broader reach. Okay, so in summary, how do we stop wildfire disasters? Well, first of all, it's not necessarily what you think, right? We can actually stop ignitions. Most are detected pretty quickly. The problem is getting to them, right? Because we have this lag response, and we don't want to do this. We suppressed fire very successfully for a century. It got us into a worse situation, right? And we need fire across our landscapes, particularly in California. And the thing is, we have solutions to actually mitigate a lot of these wildfire disasters, right? And the key thing, and where I really focus my research, is how we bring those solutions together in this framework that acknowledges the human factors and identifies what solutions work in what places. They are complex and they are site specific, but if we implement them properly, considering those human factors and understanding what elements of a disaster we're trying to mitigate in a specific place, we can do this successfully. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Crystal, for the fascinating talk. That was really enjoyable, and it's prompted quite a number of questions and comments. So I'll start first with Lee Bernacki. Says, thank you for bringing up sequoias and charismatic megaflora. I'm wondering if you are seeing federal agencies and state agencies rapidly adopt different fire practices to deal with these high value ecosystems.
Yeah, so great question, Lee. And the thing is, a lot of the places where the sequoias exist, there has already been a lot of change, right? And so this last year, in the fall, of course, we had a major wildfire in Sequoia National Park for the second year in a row, right? And one of the things that particularly the 2020 KNP complex demonstrated is that a lot of the activities that were already being implemented they've worked. Sequoia National Park has used extensive amounts of prescribed fire, particularly in and around giant forest, where sort of the core of their sequoia holdings are, and some of those most charismatic trees, right? They've been using prescribed fire in that system since the 1970s. And when the KNP complex burned, what happened was that firefighters were basically able to come in and do a little bit of work around the sequoias, and the fire just died when it got to giant forest, right? And obviously that was not true in other parts of the park. There's certainly sequoia mortality in the park. There's a lot of sequoia mortality outside of the park in the national forest, where there has not been that level of prescribed fire. So the biggest thing that the federal agencies are trying to do is figure out, okay, we know the prescribed fire works because we just had this test of a 50-year-old program and we passed, right? And now we just need to figure out how to really scale this up and implement it across larger areas. So that they're doing it, and what they need is public support. And particularly, we need more public support for prescribed fire in the national forests, because that's where the challenge is that a lot of the sequoias that have been lost in the last few years, and these really high value ecosystems, they're national forest lands, which are multi-objective, multi-use, and there's a lot less support in the forests for prescribed fire and for managed wildfire, which has a lot of the same beneficial effects as prescribed fire. And so we sort of need to up our public support for the activities that they've been trying to implement and have really run into a lot of barriers against.
Great. So that dovetails into a couple of questions that we have related to both prescribed fire and managed wildfire. So Dee Dee Smolin comments that environmental groups are voicing objection to forest health projects in the national media. How do we address their concerns and gain support for more active management of our forests?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think I'm pretty solidly on record in some of my opinions on where the role of environmental activism is in this, right? Because there are very valid concerns about forest management, and those valid concerns stem from this long history of the Forest Service being the agency that cuts down trees and cuts down a lot of big trees. And so where there is a lot of value from environmental groups is to have them come in and bring those very valid concerns to the table and be part of identifying solutions, right? And saying, okay, how do we do this in a way that we are continuing to protect the forests, right? Protect particularly the larger, older trees that we know are the most resistant and resilient to fire across this landscape, but also acknowledge that there are a lot of small trees that are actually endangering those big trees, right? And when I say small, we're talking about small diameter trees, right? And they are these little dinky things that are really what's creating our density in our forests. And so, what has not been very helpful is to have some environmental groups, definitely not all, because most of the greatest allies that we have in forest management are NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, like Save the Redwoods, right? That are very solutions oriented. But there are absolutely environmental activists and advocates that are just firmly against the Forest Service doing anything. And those groups are unfortunately blocking a lot of the activities and the discussion that needs to happen about how those activities occur to really move forward in a solutions focused way, right? So there's sort of I think there's a tendency to say, oh, we have groups, right? Oh, here's the government, here's the environmental activists, here, whatever it is. And that's not true at all. There's a spectrum across everything, right? So the goal is that people who care about these places need to come together to think about how we find solutions that work and are science informed.
Pivoting a little bit to one of those other pieces of the solution in terms of thinking about our infrastructure and smart planning, Seth Shelley makes a comment in the Marshall Fire in the Boulder area that just happened. The Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety is linking fencing between and connecting houses as one of the main factors in spread. Don't know if you want to respond to that comment. And then David also has a question related to infrastructure. Given what happened in San Francisco after the Loma Prieta quake, shouldn't underground natural gas lines subject to liquefaction-induced fractures be removed? Or how would we manage our underground energy infrastructure?
Yeah, so I have exactly zero expertise in natural gas lines, and I don't have a good grasp at all on what happened after Loma Prieta. I was not a Californian at that point in time. But this larger question of how infrastructure basically creates these feedbacks to increasing wildfire disasters. So Seth's question about the fencing, I had not seen that from IBHS, and I'm suspecting that's preliminary findings at this point, but that is not new actually, that we continue to see that a lot of this sort of, our landscaping itself, right? Not just the vegetation, but the fences, but those nice little trellises that people love to plant on the side of their house, right? All these sorts of things that are visually nice, they are highly problematic from a fire perspective. And they end up contributing to the disaster because if and COVID has given us a really fascinating set of ways of talking about wildfire, because really what we need to have is that houses be socially distanced, right? And our houses have to be socially distanced, our trees have to be socially distanced, right? Not 6 feet, but usually a lot larger actually, and around homes it's 30 foot is sort of the minimum amount of space we want to have clearance. And we have often ignored the fact that there's a lot of built infrastructure like fences within that range. And some of these recent fires in 2017 in Santa Rosa, we saw the same thing. Wooden fences allowed fire to travel from house to house to house to house. And there was no one there because the goal, that fire moves so fast, and the same thing happened in the Marshall Fire. Emergency services are focused on evacuating people and saving lives. They do not go and look at fences and try and put out fires. And it's such a simple thing, right? I mean, if the fence is on fire, you can put that out with a garden hose. So moving forward, one of the challenges is communicating how that contributes to fire danger, specifically in really high fire prone areas, right? Thinking about alternative materials, people like to have fences, right? There's a reason why. And so if you're going to have a fence, keep your dog in the yard for privacy issues. If you're next to a pretty big street, that's a really critical sound barrier. What are some of the alternative materials? And what are the ways that you can transition maybe a wooden fence before it hits your house, right? If you've got a metal gate between your wooden fence and the house, then that reduces the ability of that fire to bridge that gap and move into the house, right? And so these are little things, and it's a lot of little things that lead to really big disasters. So that this is, what the Marshall Fire is showing us is that it's a lot of things we already knew, and it's just, again, amplifying them and showing people that it can also happen outside of California.
So we're just about out of time, but maybe we can squeeze one last question in here. So Lillian Davila asks if you could comment on some of the site specificity and regional variation that we see in wildfires. For example, correlation of drought and fires in California versus island communities. There are different environmental processes at work. And how do we implement these solutions, in consideration of geography as a geographer?
Yeah, no, and this is, where my greatest interest lies, is it has to be site specific, and it's site specific in terms of both the factors that will allow fire to grow. So, in this idea of and islands like Puerto Rico or Hawaii, I've actually done work in Hawaii. You know, when you go to Hawaii, you tend to think of it as a place that, oh, yeah, actually there's pretty high moisture levels here, right? Like this couldn't burn. But it turns out that in a place where the vegetation is used to having a lot of moisture, even a short-term drought can make it highly flammable. When I lived on the East Coast, the joke was that if you went 2 weeks without rain, you were in a drought and things could burn because the vegetation is not used to having to conserve its moisture, right? And so 2 weeks without rain basically dries that vegetation out enough so that it becomes fuel for a fire. California, 2 weeks without rain is our norm, right? And so our vegetation is much more adapted to that. And it also means we have to think about things like long-term drought, like we're in right now, and how that affects different types of vegetation, right? And so what that means is that our strategies are really different in terms of how we manage vegetation and also how we approach some of those solutions, thinking about, oh, is this a place where fire is only going to burn under high winds, so we really have to worry about embers? Or is this a place where fire is only going to burn when we get a substantial drought and there's a ton of vegetation, like in a place like Hawaii, right? Tons of vegetation. So for them, it's less about embers and that they're just going to have a really large amount of fuel in the few times that they ever get enough of a drought that allows it to burn. So there, it's not about necessarily vegetation management. It's more about thinking about those acute periods of drought and how you can manage fire danger when those acute periods of drought come. Hope that answers it. Okay.
Great. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank Crystal for today's talk and for getting us to start thinking about innovation and disruption in the fire space and how we're all going to live with fire moving forward. So thank you very much, Crystal. And for those of you that are interested, again, you can connect with our speaker via Twitter, and we've posted her Twitter notes on, or her Twitter handle in the chat. And today's recording will be up for viewing tomorrow afternoon at our YouTube channel, Citrus UC. Thank you very much.